So I talked about the two halves of this system. So the first is the learning record store. And you see the definition from the actual specification, but this is essentially the central concept in xAPI. So when we're considering adopting xAPI, we need to know about what the learning record store is. Again, I mentioned it's a RESTful web service API. It accepts the experience data primarily in the shape of statements and includes a document store for ephemeral data storage, right? So other things that we might need to go along with our experience. And that's about as far into what an LRS is that I'm going to go. I'm not going to talk about the specific web service APIs. All of these things are well documented on our websites and other webinars, et cetera. But it's good to have this base understanding. And then, so what talks to the LRS? What communicates with it? What sends it the data? It's the natural partner to the LRS, and that's the learning record provider, right? So it's going to leverage the LRS for data capture and retrieval. And it's generally what we talk about when we talk about the experience. It is the simulation. It is the browser-based content. It is the thing that is going to leverage that LRS. It's not always that, but that is the thing that's going to create data and capture the data. And it needs a way to get the LRS endpoint and the authorization credentials. That's probably the biggest reason that there are now launch specifications like CMI5, is to facilitate that handshake that allows those two systems to talk. And now Ben is going to talk a little bit more about what, whether you're going to be an LRP, whether you're going to be an LRS, whether you're both. Go ahead, Ben.
All right. So yeah, as Brian was saying, thank you, Brian. I'm going to talk about, do you want to be an LRP? Do you want to be LRS? Yeah. Do you want to be both? If you're creating content, if you're creating an authoring tool, then I think that's a pretty, clear answer there, that you're going to be an LRP. Whereas if you're an LMS vendor, then you're probably more looking at using an LRS. It's interesting to consider here that sometimes even an LRS can be acting as an LRP in the case that it's going and sending out statements in the case of statement piping, which we'll get to in a bit. So for LRPs, yes, content developers, experience developers, and there's a little bit of distinction here. When I talk about content, I'm talking more about your traditional sort of page turner e-learning content you would expect, and experience being all the more non-traditional things you might be thinking about doing, like simulations, AR, VR, or even tracking in-person attendance. Job performance capture here is really anything that happens on the job that's not training. You still might want to capture that and keep track of it so you can then associate it back with training or other learning that was going on. So what is the minimum desired feature set you might want to see in an LRP, a learning record provider? As Brian said earlier, there needs to be a way to launch. I think we keep talking about this because it's a common thing that I think people forget about sometimes. Is you have an LRS, you can send statements to that LRS, and you think, well, why we can just have any bit of content out there we want, sending statements to the LRS. But how do you know to authenticate to that? You could, of course, just hard code in a URL to that LRS. You could hard code in credentials, but that would be a bad idea. We've seen people do that in demos and think, gee, this is great, but it's not something you can continue to do. So we have launch specifications. CMI5 provides a nice way to do launch. Even in the early days of xAPI, we came up with something. It was actually a bit off the cuff for me for doing launches, and I was a bit, frankly, dismayed to see how much that took off, because I put that out as something really I was hoping people would kick around and make refinements on, but people didn't want to talk about it that much. They just started using it, and surprisingly, it's worked well enough. So then you want to consider profiles. So going back to Brian saying that there wasn't really an information model, profiles is how we add that back on. xAPI itself, it provides the data model, it provides the transport. Profiles is where you can start to make sense of this data. So that's something you want to think about. I believe I'll talk about a little more about profiles a little while later. Also, I want to note that there are some libraries available for helping you with acting as an LRP in a variety of languages that we've put out. I think some other folks have put out libraries as well. Some of them have been maintained better than others, but they're at least a good starting point.